Hello, thank you for being here. I'm Felicity Ezewike. Mali is in dire crisis, and the situation continues to have serious implications for the entire Sahel and West Africa, and by extension, our continent's stability. Jihadist groups, notably Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimi, for short JNIM, is enforcing a fuel blockade in the capital, Bamako, and attacking supply routes. Schools and businesses have shut down, and some foreign governments, the latest being France, have told their citizens to leave Mali. In response, the African Union Commission has issued a strong statement expressing deep concern and demanding urgent international action, including intelligence sharing and sustained cooperation, not just with Western powers, I beg your pardon, but a move that is led by African stakeholders. Analysts say if Mali collapses into a bigger insurgency zone, the threat spills over borders, refugees, weapons, and instability will pass through the region. Africa cannot wait for external solutions. So there are questions. How must African institutions step up? What international support is realistic? And how can Mali recover sovereignty without becoming dependent? Well, to speak to these questions and more on one slot, I have Chris Otieno, Regional Security Project Director, Traz Intelligence and Security Solutions Limited. We'll be joined a little later by Paul Melly, but for now, we have Héni, Nsaibia, Senior Analyst for West Africa at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, ACLED. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Let me start with you, Héni. Bring us up to speed. What is the current security picture in Mali? How far has this jihadist influence advanced in recent weeks?
It began 2 months ago when the group JNIM announced a blockade on the major towns of Kai and near the Sahel. However, this has become to affect the capital itself, since they have cut off access on major transit routes leading to Senegal, Guinea, and the Ivorian border, attacking fuel tankers, oftentimes in the dozens, and this has created a quite dire situation with massive fuel shortages across southern and central Mali, and overall a quite deteriorating security situation with many foreigners being kidnapped, especially workers from India, China, and other countries, reaching an all-time high this year of 2025. And this is almost the double of the previous peak that we observed in 2022. And
okay.
in this process, they have also obtained.
Yes, the situation is indeed worrisome. Paul Melly has joined us. Thank you for being here. Paul Melly is Consulting Fellow, Africa Program, Chatham House. Good to have you on one slot. But let me come to Chris and ask this question. The fuel blockade by the Al-Qaeda-backed group, a lot of analysts have said it is unprecedented in Mali. We already know that the ruler, Assimi Goïta, is asking citizens to reduce movement as one of the ways to manage the fuel crisis. How does this economic warfare reshape the conflict, perhaps?
Quite a number of effects, and thank you so much for having me. There are quite a number of effects in the fuel blockade. One and the foremost, which you have mentioned, there will be, of course, adjustments, which you'd call a structural adjustments program by the Malian government to try and contain the situation of that blockade. We will see businesses, the economic front, businesses will be shut down in the capital of Bamako, and a lot of other ripple effects to include citizens not accessing goods of necessity into their daily lives. And that means a change in a way of life, which is one of the actual effects or deliverance from a terrorist group. That does not play very well in the economy of Mali. That does not play well in the social fabric of Mali, and that does not actually promote what the Malian government is going out for. That's why we are seeing them going out to ask for help. AU itself has come up pronouncing a lot of words against these attacks and these blockades. But we need to see AU step up and do something much more than that, counter these effects and ensure that Mali is a normal way of living. So it is quite impactful in what they're doing, and the effect will be domino in terms of what comes out of it in the long run.
I mean, AU and statements. We'll come to that in a bit. Let's get your opening thoughts as well, Paul. Just taking a look at how unusual is this tactic of a field blockade for a jihadist group, and what does it tell us about perhaps their strategy? Melly, we don't have him. Okay, I'll bring that question to Héni then. Héni, did you get the question I was putting to Paul?
Economic warfare by JNIM is nothing new. It's something that the group has developed over the years. It has included targeting weekly markets, supply convoys, commercial convoys, and also destroying public infrastructure, targeting telecommunications network, electric lines, water lines. And what we see today is a sort of more sophisticated form of economic warfare that the group has developed over the years. And frankly, many say that the group itself might have been surprised by the success of this fuel blockade or embargo, but we are definitely witnessing a new stage of JNIM's insurgency in Mali, but also throughout the region, with ripple effects across West Africa as an increasing number of countries are affected, including Benin, Togo, but also more recently Nigeria itself, especially the western and northwestern parts of the country.
Yeah, and then the ripple effect around the continent as well. Chris talked to us about this military government in Mali and its response thus far. Earlier, I said that the military ruler was asking people to reduce movement, traveling, as one way to manage the field situation. Some would say that's quite trivial and not a response one would expect. But beyond the field blockade, what is your assessment of the military-led government's response, and how is it de-escalating or escalating the situation?
I think one and foremost thing is that their response is reactive. We are not supposed to see reactivity from governments in the Sahel region. We're supposed to see proactivity. Now, the economic warfare waged by these Akim affiliates, of course, aims to disrupt the way of life. They, of course, went out to put on blockades that has led to fuel shortages, and of course, that will force a number of businesses across various sectors of life in Mali to shut down. For example, schools and business will shut down. What does that mean? It means the way of life will be disrupted. What is the purpose of a government? Of course, it's to protect the integrity and border integrity and sovereignty of any country.
Okay, I think we have a bit of a challenge with Chris' network. Chris, can you still hear me? I just want to try again. Can you hear us, Chris? Okay, we don't have Chris. Okay, we don't have Chris, but we have Paul Melly now. Paul, if you can just confirm you can hear me, please.
I can hear you now clearly.
All right, thank you very much for being here once again. We're looking, Chris was talking about the response by the military-led government in Mali to all of this insurgency and insecurity. I want to take your thoughts on that. Would you say this military government is outmatched or unprepared for this shift in insurgent tactics?
The problem is that in 2023, the military government decided that it was going to give high priority to re-establishing the authority of the central government over the far north of Mali, where there are Tuareg separatist groups who had signed a peace agreement back in 2015 in return for quite a wide degree of regional decentralization. And so that peace agreement, although there had been fragilities, it had more or less stayed in place. But the Malian military, this military government, decided to give a big priority to launching a campaign. It abandoned the peace agreement and it launched basically a long offensive against the Tuareg separatists in the north of the country, which meant that it was deploying troops right up into the center of the Sahara Desert. And although that offensive was successful in taking control of the main towns in that region, and particularly Kidal, which was the center of the separatist movement, it means that a huge military effort was diverted, if you like, towards the north, which hadn't previously really been necessary because there'd been French troops and then United Nations peacekeepers in that region, and the army had been focused more in the center and the south of the country. So that big strategic choice, I think, has left it under-resourced to confront this big push by the jihadists in the far south of Mali. I think that's something that's really significant. If you look at the map, you can see that the south of Mali, where the current crisis is so intense, the region south and west of Bamako, extending towards the borders with Senegal, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire, that is very far away from the regions where the northern separatists were active, which is roughly, if you're looking at the map, where the sort of L and I of Mali is, the big letters. That is where the Malian army decided to concentrate a lot of its effort over the last couple of years. And so it's left it hugely under-resourced, underprepared, I think, to deal with this offensive in the west and the south. And the offensive is all the more dangerous because it's the jihadists don't have to control all the territory. They just have to cause so much disruption that in effect their attacks are basically closing the key supply arteries for the Malian economy. So Mali's fuel comes in really from two routes. It comes in by tanker truck from Senegal and from Côte d'Ivoire. And both of those highways are now subject to very frequent attacks. And although some of the drivers are bravely continuing to risk it, they're really taking their lives in their hands, and many tanker trucks are being attacked. The road from Guinea to Bamako is still a little more secure, but there'd been problems at the fuel terminal in Conakry port in Guinea. So actually that isn't really much of an alternative supply route for bringing in fuel, although obviously you can bring in some other goods. But the two big trade arteries from Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire and from Dakar in Senegal, they're the ones that are basically being cut, and that's what's suffocating the Malian economy.
Okay. I really needed you to exhaust your thought on that question. Chris, let's come back to you quickly. You were speaking about, how the Mali junta is reacting to this crisis. What are your thoughts after listening to Melly?
I think the junta is reacting quite dimly, because when you look at the target of this Akim affiliate terrorist group, one of the things is to escalate their jihadist violence. I mean, of course, bringing in blockades, and of course, the need to coordinate a lot of other things. They want to attack military bases to send a very strong message. So what they have done is basically to showcase their ability to stay in their kin, confederate, and that basically means that the government needs to step up its response. First and foremost, we need to see a government-driven strategic modernization of the military for them to be able to adequately respond proactively collect intelligence, determine what this terrorist group is going to do, and of course go way ahead and to be able to predictably analyze what these groups would do, and go ahead and stop them from doing that. If we let them go on as they're going on right now, that will, of course, bolden them in terms of the attack they want to launch in the country of Mali, and that has a domino effect, a ripple effect on the entire country setup. It will limit movement of persons. It will cause humanitarian crisis. There will be a lot of death of Malian citizens from this kind of an attack. So therefore, the government of Mali, through the military, needs to do much more than just issue statements. They need to be active. They need to go out there. They need to send boots on the ground to adequately respond to the threat that's coming to the country and ensure that they neutralize this threat to as much as is realistically and practically possible, just to ensure that this Akima-affiliated group does not take root in the country of Mali and disrupt the way of life to all its citizens. That is what they need to do, and they need to do that quite urgently. They need to share intelligence with other communities. They need to modernize, bring in technology to do as much as possible in terms of gathering intelligence and action.
The question of the AU and, issuing strong statements, I was wishing we could push a little further, but you cannot talk about this matter. They are the reason we're having this conversation. The statement that they have issued, we just wanted to set a background for what we're doing. Héni, we all know that the Mali situation is not new, yet we have the African Union issuing statement talking about urgent international action. What exactly is urgent right now in your thoughts, and why must it be now? And just to add to it, based off what Chris has been saying, what is the expected action from the AU beyond issuing statements such as these?
The AU has been quite on the sidelines since the crisis began. Early on, they were engaged after peacekeepers were deployed to Mali, but after that, they have been quite silent on many issues, especially the ongoing insecurity and instability that has plagued the region for now over a decade. So a more credible response is also to pressure these regimes a bit further, especially going beyond the military cooperation and intelligence sharing, since, the real issue at the bottom of things is more inclusive governance, political dialogue, and real accountability in a conflict environment where the civilian population really has been suffering major abuses by all the armed actors involved. And this is also fueling the ongoing developments that we see today. So it's a clear escalation that's been ongoing for quite a while now. And I don't think calls for military cooperation and intelligence sharing would kind of mitigate the ongoing issue. And we have also seen how these regimes have distanced themselves from foreign partners, especially Western allies, but also within the regional bloc of ECOWAS. And this by itself has had repercussions across the region, declining bilateral cooperation between countries like Niger and Nigeria, but also Niger and Benin. So, this is not only a central Sahelian problem anymore. It has become much more region-wide. And we have seen that both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates have set sight on the borderlands between Benin, Niger, and Nigeria. And these are the ripple effects that I already mentioned. But I think pressuring these regimes for a transition to not maybe only civilian, but to maybe broader coalitions with significant more civilian and technocratic components to kind of steer back these countries on the right track.
Paul, I want to come to you, and what I'm going to ask you is probably going to be a mouthful, so please bear with me. AU, I said a bit, this is not new. They give statements all the time. Could you share with us thoughts from the Chatham House about resolving the Mali situation and how the AU is going about doing this? And of course, okay, I did say it's going to be a mouthful, beyond the call for international cooperation and intelligence sharing, what can the AU do? Please talk to us about that.
and this is a particular thing that's particularly significant about the West African region, more than some other regions of the continent, the AU has always, at least since the days of the Liberian crisis at the beginning of the 1990s, the AU has always allowed ECOWAS to take the lead, because ECOWAS, the West African Regional Bloc, has had quite a strong philosophy of regional cooperation. So in some ways, the AU statement, it's not really about practical action by the AU itself, but it's providing political cover, if you like, diplomatic cover for a re-establishment of partnership and cooperation between these central Sahelian states, which, let's not forget, chose to leave ECOWAS in January of this year. The ECOWAS had hoped to persuade them to stay as members and pursue an eventual transition back to civilian rule. But the Central Sahel countries, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, they chose to leave. And there's still a lot of difficult political feelings, if you like, between the other ECOWAS states and the Central Sahel states. So the AU statement, in a way, although it sounds rather narrow, just calling for intelligence cooperation, that kind of thing, could provide some sort of diplomatic cover and encouragement, both for the Sahelian countries and those in coastal West Africa, to rebuild their sort of partnership links. One of the things that the Central Sahel countries have, under their military regimes, have repeatedly said is that they feel that the rest of ECOWAS didn't give them much security support during previous years. But that's rather to overlook the fact that there was a very large United Nations force in Mali, which took very heavy casualties. It's actually the highest casualty rate of any peacekeeping mission in the history of the United Nations. And a large part of its sort of 14,000 troops were in fact from the rest of West Africa. So there are many soldiers from countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Senegal, Guinea, all of the coastal, Togo, all the coastal states who've taken very heavy risks, and the casualties were severe in trying to protect communities in Mali from the jihadists. So restoring trust and goodwill and a readiness to work together is probably a key step, and that's where the AU statement could help, because the AU, in a sense, being an all-African organization, and it may actually be quite convenient that it's based in Addis and therefore very distant from the region. That gives it perhaps a certain step back, not quite neutrality, but a sort of, it's not been intimately involved in the split where those countries broke away.
Chris, political, diplomatic encouragement or cover, I'm writing from Paul's submission, by the AU via the statement he just made. What are your thoughts about the real purpose that this statement will serve in real term towards the resolution of the Malian conflict, or to help with this current blockade that we have?
It needs to be done. This statement just does not need to be a statement left in Héni. It needs to be forwarded to the United Nations General Assembly or the Security Council to make sure that it is driven across the international governments for them to see which ways they need to come in and support the Malian government restoring peace and democracy or order in the country of Mali. We also need to be further worried. America has said the other day through their president, they're going to attack Nigeria because they continue the attack of Christians in Nigeria. Do we see Akim operating in Nigeria? Yes, we see Akim operating in Nigeria. And JNIM is just an affiliate of Akim. So that needs to worry us more. AU needs just to do much more than making statements. They need to drive this agenda through all the international security consultative structures to make sure that Mali is receiving the required attention and the right intervention is being deployed in Mali to ensure that we are safeguarding the stability of that nation and we are thwarting any attack that could be propagated or is in the propagation by this kind of a group, because that means a lot the sovereignty of Mali, and that could mean a lot the neighboring countries, for example, Niger, for example, Nigeria, Libya, Mauritania, all those that have this kind of a problem in their nation. So yes, we need to use our African consolidated structures. For example, my country, Kenya, has a veto power in the Security Council. So we need to use that to ensure that we are calling in the international community to move us as fast as appropriate to go ahead and support the government of Mali to ensure that we are restoring the right security infrastructure and posture that is required for this country of Mali.
Héni, international support, how realistic is it to mobilize that, given that some West African states already, countries, France, US, and the UK, advising their citizens to leave Mali? It doesn't look much like they are willing to come up and be a part of the process, is it?
Well, I don't think there's a big appeal for countries like France to militarily intervene as long as the military regimes are in power, especially as they pivoted towards Russia and have engaged with the private military company, the Wagner Group, and more recently Africa Corps. And yeah, I mean, that solution hasn't really brought any stability. And I mean, we can clearly see that today with the expansion of JNIM into the western and southern parts of Mali. So no, I don't think there is a big appetite for a military or international-led coalition. But instead, as my colleague said, there is a possibility for more engagement by neighboring African states to provide support to Mali. But I would echo again what I think is important to highlight, that there is not only a military solution to the issue of Mali and also the Sahelian conflict, but also it is a much more bigger political problem related to inconclusive or inexclusive governance with large segments of rural populations feeling marginalized and outside of the political processes and center of power, if you put it like that.
And I want to stay with you. What should be the focus in? You said it beyond the military solution, there are other options to explore. Those that are feeling marginalized, who should be leading the conversation in this area? And if you were to be offering thoughts on the way to start off this conversation, what would you go? Héni, I'm staying with you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, there are different ways, but we had brokers before, including Algeria, which now even have been scapegoat on accusations of providing cover for militant and rebel groups. But there are obviously other regional stakeholders, except for Algeria, that could, host some form of talks or dialogue to mitigate the situation or at least improve it momentarily. But it's, like I said, it's a big issue. It has become increasingly regionalized since it affects many different countries. So in the immediate, yeah, there might be a military solution to secure major transit routes and to get the Malian economy up running, but also functioning as normal. But still, it demands a much more holistic approach than just a military one.
Well, I wanted to share your thoughts on the humanitarian toll that we're looking at. I mean, with fuel shortages, supply blockades, and societal disruption, why is this vulnerability that we really need to pay attention to?
I think we need to remember, and Héni hinted at this when he was talking about the difficult situation of many rural populations. We need to remember that the Sahel countries are still overwhelmingly rural. So, for example, in Niger, 83% of the population live in rural areas, not in towns. In Mali, the population of Bamako is sort of 3, 4, perhaps 5 million, but the large majority of Malians live in provincial towns and in villages, or from pastoralism. The same in Burkina. And so you've got a twin humanitarian crisis. There's this very immediate crisis in Bamako where we can see fuel shortages. For example, they've just forced the suspension of schools for the last 2 weeks. The price of goods is going up. Life for people in Bamako is getting very difficult. But in large parts of rural Mali, it has been difficult for years. And that's also true in Burkina. It's also true in large parts of Niger. There are thousands of schools that have been closed now for several years. There are many parts of the Sahel where the state is no longer able to operate, provides no services at all, and effectively is more or less completely excluded. In some cases, the state was already, even before the security crisis, had a very patchy presence. But obviously, there are large areas now where, for example, when we reach the periods of the year, basically from May, June onwards, when the remaining food supplies left from the previous year's harvest are running really low, the Sahel did have a very well-established system for getting emergency stocks of food distributed to vulnerable communities. But that, and a system for monitoring where those, what the position was, where the food risks were. But obviously, if most government officials and anything associated with the state has no access to these areas, it becomes incredibly difficult to deliver that sort of help, just as it's difficult to deliver education or health services. So that you've got this sort of twin humanitarian crisis, the one that everybody's noticing in Bamako just now, but this much deeper, wider humanitarian crisis that has been afflicting probably 15 million people, perhaps 20 million people, possibly 25, right across all three countries for years.
Quite unfortunate, really. Let's go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be taking on the vacuum that's being created with this fuel supply shortage. The whole state is seeming to have issues with leadership as well. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. It's still one slot. We still have our guests who are looking at the AU's call for international action on the urgent security crisis in Mali. How urgent is it? That's some of the questions we're trying to find answers to. My guests are Chris Otieno, Regional Security Project Director, Traz Intelligence and Security Solutions Limited. We also have Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow, Africa Program, Chatham House, Héni Nsaibia, Senior Analyst for West Africa at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'm a bit, okay, I'll come to you, Héni, and ask, how factual do you think the thoughts around informal and militant governance taking root in rural Mali? Paul told us that aside the attention they were paying to Bamako, rural communities are the ones we should be paying further attention to. If true that there is some, local governance taking place away from the military leadership, what would that mean for the wider region?
There is definitely an aspect of these militant groups framing themselves as competing governance actors to the regimes or the governments, and this is a reality in vast rural areas across the central Sahel. And especially in vast parts of northern and central Mali, northern and eastern Burkina Faso. And this is very rudimentary governance. It's not like they provide much in terms of basic services, but it's justice. They counter banditry. They tax the population in harvest, in cash, and they impose a form of insurgent social order which also can include gender segregation, certain rules for the civilian population to abide to. And this is also part of a broader strategy that especially JNIM has embarked on, and that is to pressure communities to engage directly with them in various forms of agreements. Those who have not agreed have often been subject to blockades or embargoes similar to the one we see around Bamako, but in a much smaller scale. So we see this kind of evolution of this strategy of imposing sieges which began really in 2017 with smaller villages and then escalated to encompass major towns and including larger towns, like for instance in Burkina Faso, where we have Djibo or Seba and other large urban centers in rural areas that have been under blockade for several years. And the regimes have not been able to effectively break those blockades. And this is due to JNIM's interest in really fragilize the ties between populations and the central state. And by also doing so, get these people under their influence.
I mean, I'm just looking at the time now, and it seems we have very limited time to conclude this conversation. So I'll shift towards solution questions. Chris, can Mali rebuild while also resisting external dependence? How can it assert sovereignty and yet seek help?
It is fact that Mali has a defense force to the sovereignty of its state. They must follow through a strategic modernization to ensure that they have internal and local capacity to ward off all these kinds of attacks. At the same time, they must exploit public-private partnerships, cooperations, and ensure that all these certain developments done in the private sector find their way into the public sector, just to ensure that they're exploiting that to diminish any possibility of the vulnerabilities being exploited by these kind of groups to commit violence against the citizens of Mali. Equally, they must exploit their international partnerships to ensure that they have partners who can support them in times of dire need. But the top of the list is that they must have their own internal capacity to be able to look at the risk velocity of this kind of persons or this kind of groups attacking Mali and be able to respond as is adequately required. That alone will establish the sovereignty of Mali as a self-governing state that does not in whatsoever way tolerate external interference that could create fear amongst its population, and of course go a long ways in disrupting its normal way of life. So yes, they need to explore the strategic modernization to ensure that they have that capacity to be able to defend themselves and the sovereignty of their country.
Paul, we've been talking about the AU and aside issuing statement. What would be your suggestions as to mechanisms that the AU and perhaps other regional bodies should do to build, rather, maybe they should build to monitor progress and coordinate across borders so that it is not one country taking the lead, but a collective of African leaders?
I think the role that the AU can have is particularly to overcome this political problem that's been caused, and where by the decision of the three central Sahelian countries to leave ECOWAS, which means that where there needs to be some diplomatic bridge building going on, rebuilding of trust, and that's very, very difficult. Among the West African countries, we're beginning to see some bilateral relationships. Nigeria has really engaged very heavily in trying to reach out to Niger to build just practical cooperative relationships. Ghana, the same towards Burkina Faso. Senegal, the same towards Mali. And Guinea already has quite good relations with Mali. So there's something to work with there. And the role that the AU can perhaps have is that because ultimately it's the AU which is the determinant of, if you like, of the political legitimacy of regimes, because under the AU codes, of course, the seizure of power through military coups is not regarded as legitimate. So while that long-term political issue has yet to be sorted out, it does mean that in the meantime, the AU as this sort of all-Africa body may have that capacity to help try and coordinate and provide a bit of sort of political cover. For example, some international support that might be provided in terms, for example, of intelligence support, supply support, or whatever. Many international partners will be very wary of wanting to do anything that is perceived as undermining ECOWAS. But if there is, as it were, political cover from the AU, that may allow them to provide some more practical assistance. I don't think, as Héni said, I think we wouldn't be expecting to see a return of French troops in large number or some new big United Nations force. That seems very unlikely in the foreseeable future. But discrete, practical, behind-the-scenes support, whether by a wide range of international partners, that's where the AU can provide cover. But a lot will also depend just on the practical day-to-day capacity of ECOWAS and the Central Sahel states to rebuild their practical cooperation. There is across West Africa, there's a very strong sense of regional identity. Among this split wasn't a split between peoples, if you like. It was very much something that happened at government or regime level. And so among ordinary West Africans, there's a very strong sense, regardless of whether they're in the Sahel states or the coastal states, of shared regional identity and goodwill. And there's plenty of scope to rebuild some cooperative support on that. But we shouldn't be under any illusions. Obviously, the situation in all three countries is very difficult, and in Mali at the moment is absolutely critical.
A lot to think about there. Héni, you talked about beyond military solutions. How should Africa-led peace processes differ? This is not the first time we're talking about solutions and models. So how should it differ from older models that were set to be dominated by external powers? How can we do that?
Very difficult aspect of everything related to negotiating peace. We have seen local level negotiations. We have seen regional powers engaging as power brokers. Like I mentioned already, Algeria with the Algiers peace accords that were in place between Tuareg-led rebel groups and the central government in Bamako. But I also think that regional institutions can play a more vital role in the context of also pressuring both regimes and other stakeholders to re-engage in dialogue. And also another aspect not really touched in this conversation is the often deep cleavages that we find on the ground in countries like Burkina Faso and Mali, because many communities have been engaged on different sides of the conflict. Some are pro-government militiamen, others are affiliated with jihadi groups or rebel groups that is fighting the government. So there also needs to be some reconciliation between local communities in different parts of these countries.
Okay. If you were to pick, Chris, 3 vital actions for Mali and its partners right now, what would they be? I think that question is going to go around.
Yeah, I think one critical item would be partnerships, local, regional, and international partnerships to come very handy in helping them resolve this matter. There must also be local capacity development and modernization to ensure that, yes, they have their own intervention mechanisms in place which they can activate before they call in the international partners. And of course, there needs to be a drive towards bringing down these violence levels of these terrorism kind of attacks, because the more they go on, the more they embolden these groups like JNIM, and that would mean severity and multiplicity in the number of attacks, which of course could jeopardize the entire posture, security posture of the country of Mali. And that has ripple effects, just not to Mali alone, but also these neighbors. And that is not a very good posture to have at this particular time. So they must work towards reposturing themselves to be able to give a perception of very strong security networks and capabilities to be able to ward off this kind of terrorist attacks.
Paul, the question is, if you were to pick 3 vital actions for Mali and its partners right now, what would they be?
Well, I think an important internal one in Mali probably is a fresh process of internal reconciliation. At the moment, those who have criticized the government or have been politically opposed to it have been, as it were, shut out. And so the government, if it could launch some sort of new process of political reconciliation, reaching out, this is a long way from moving to a political transition to a new elected government. Obviously, that's something for the longer term. But just a process of reaching out and engaging a broad base of domestic support, social and political support, talking to people who are critical of the government as well as those who support it, and that might be one option, and that could, for example, include a renewed gesture. It would be a very difficult political step for the government to swallow, but towards the Northern Tuareg groups who were in the Algiers peace agreement. Then a second thing, I think, is the process of really rebuilding trust with Mali's coastal neighbors, particularly Senegal and particularly Côte d'Ivoire, because they're 2 countries with large, capable militaries, and they're also the key trade corridor countries. So the relations with Senegal are not too bad, but relations with Côte d'Ivoire have been very difficult. So sorting that out has to be a next priority. And then I think possibly, again, reaching out and re-engaging with the full range of international partners. Remember, it's at the decision of the Malian government that the French and particularly the United Nations forces were pulled out. And so partners such as the European Union and its individual member states, even including France, although that politically is a very difficult relationship, but also other partners beyond Europe, the US, Canada, of course, crucially, that whole wider ECOWAS bloc, that kind of diplomatic reaching out, all of that is necessary as a sort of prelude, if you like, to renewed military effort. At the moment, it appears to be a military force only strategy, and that's clearly, while obviously the military side is important, that's clearly not enough.
Okay. Héni, your thoughts on that?
I think reconciliation is a very important aspect, as my colleagues already mentioned, and that is break the isolation, including with neighboring countries. You have the case of Algeria with mounting tensions between Mali and Algeria. So it's breaking international isolation, both near and far, obviously. Other stakeholders like the EU certainly have willingness to re-engage and at different levels related to development and other aspects. At the same time, internal reconciliation in the country is likely important, as I already mentioned. There's been a continuous militiafication of the conflict, not only in Mali, but also in Burkina Faso, which has deepened cleavages between communities. So that is two. Thirdly, yeah, I think there is a need for a genuine process of transition from military rule to more inclusive governance. And, you know, these military regimes have taken increasingly authoritarian turns, which means that the political classes have been suppressed, many of them jailed, and to kind of re-engage, to free political prisoners and launch a form of more inward-looking for a better kind of a future. And I think these are the three different aspects that I want to underscore.
Héni, Paul, and Chris, thank you very much for obliging us on one slot today. We appreciate your time and the insights you've provided. Thank you. All right. In closing, I would say from this conversation, it is clear that military responses alone will not fix Mali's security challenges, but restoring trust in institutions, investing in local governance, protecting civilians, and ensuring regional cooperation will hold better sway and perhaps is core to any sustainable solution. The question now isn't just whether the world will respond. It is whether Africa will lead. Will our regional bodies step up beyond strong statements? Will our governments look beyond sovereignty to collective survival? And will our citizens hold them all accountable? Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.